Well, we come to our final lecture in Roman Catholicism, topic 24, A Global Church Faces Its Past. And we're going to talk about two things simultaneously in this lecture. We're going to talk about the present, all the way down to the 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century, and we're going to talk about the past. As one famous French philosopher, Michel Foucault, said, a history of the present is always a history of the past, and a history of the past is always a history of the present. And if you remember, going all the way back to the beginning of this course, ignorance is not bliss when it comes to history. Ignorance is certainly not bliss when it comes to religious history. And we also need to keep in mind what I talked about in the last lecture, that we can only say so much about modern history because not enough time has really elapsed to evaluate all the stuff that's gone on in the 21st century and back through the 20th century and even the 19th century. We need another 100 years or so before we can really decide if what happened was good in the church, if what happened was bad, the actual effects of it, etc. And this is true for all modern history. And like I said, presidents, politicians, etc., that we might hate now might be heroes 200 or 300 years from now when historians look back and analyze what they did. You just don't know. And the opposite could be the case as well, is that people that are thought of as great, wonderful leaders, presidents, etc. Historians might look back at this centuries from now and say, nope, they weren't good at all. Modern Catholicism in the 20th century is really associated with this Pope, John the 23rd. John the 23rd was this progressive Pope. He wanted to open up the church to the world, and it's John the 23rd who really opens up the Catholic Church to the modern world and says, you know what, it's time for us to embrace modernity. We need to stop circling the wagons. We need to stop fighting against modernity. We need to stop being closed off from the Protestants and from other religious traditions like the Muslims, the Jews, Buddhists, etc. And many liberal Catholics today and progressive Catholics look to John the 23rd as the ideal pope because he was a Renaissance man and he was an open-minded pope. The opposite of this would be conservative Catholics today look to John Paul II as the man, as the ideal pope. John the 23rd, his years are 1958 to 1963. Had he lived longer, it would be interesting to see where Catholicism is today. In many respects, I think John the 23rd, I don't like using this terminology, but I think he was in many respects more progressive and more liberal than even Pope Francis. But John the 23rd came to the papacy with all of this experience, not just religious experience, but secular experience. He worked as a diplomat with Bulgaria and with Turkey, so he was well versed in governmental affairs and the art of diplomacy. He helped Jews escape during World War II. So even though maybe the Vatican as a whole wasn't doing as much as they should for Jews during World War II, certainly individual priests and bishops did a lot, like John the 23rd, or the man who would eventually become Pope John the 23rd. John the 23rd was also a scholar. He was trained as a church historian, so he certainly wasn't ignorant of the church's past and the good things the church had done as well as the faults of the church. And as a product of the modern 20th century, and really a product of modern Catholicism, he was open to many of the ideas of the Enlightenment and of modernism. And he took this both and approach, which is so important in Catholicism, that maybe there are things in modernism that we should look at, that we should embrace. Maybe this shouldn't be an either or binary. What he's most well known for, except he didn't live to see the completion of this, is calling a council known as Vatican II, which lasted from 1962 to 1965. There are still Catholics today, in fact some of the nuns that run around Albertus Magnus, that remember when the changes of Vatican II were implemented. And they will tell you it was strange. One Sunday you're doing this at Mass, the next Sunday you're doing something completely different. But Vatican II was going back to the future, if you will. It really looked at the tradition of the church, it analyzed it, It brought up things that had been lost in the tradition. It looked at what was good that wasn't being talked about, and it said, we're going to take all of that and we're going to modernize it and Catholicize it and bring it into the 20th century. So Vatican II, some have actually said, is the true reformation of the Catholic Church. It's not Trent, it's not Vatican I, it's actually Vatican II, because Vatican II is where the church sits down and says, how do we reintroduce the faith without throwing out the tradition? How do we do this? How do we modernize? So what you have at Vatican II is you have reform, you have renewal, and you have this phrase that is very, very important, aggiornamento. Aggiornamento means to update, but it doesn't mean to throw out. Remember, in Catholicism, you never throw out the past. You update the past. It's kind of like, if you want to think of it this way, aggiornamento means what happens on a Mac computer or an iPhone every now and then is you get the iOS X whatever update. Now, when you look at your phone or you look at your computer, hopefully in an ideal world, a lot of things don't change and a lot of things don't disappear. It still looks familiar to you. Yet at the same time, you have a sense of, but it's different. And that's really what Vatican II was doing. And of course, I'm generalizing here and summarizing because this is an introductory course, but this is the church saying, we are going to update without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's not going to be like a major upgrade to the church where everything just changes. It's an update. The individual who would end up overseeing the end of Vatican II is a pope named Paul VI, who came after John the 23rd. And he certainly also continues to bring the church into the modern world. Like I said, though, it would have been interesting if John the 23rd had lived longer, because he probably would have taken things a bit further than Paul VI, and certainly much further than John Paul II. Paul VI lived from 1963 to 1978. He's responsible for making the Roman Curia and the College of Cardinals more international. What Paul VI realized, and it's so true today in Roman Catholicism, is that Roman Catholicism, its seat of power is no longer Europe, and it certainly isn't the United States and Canada and Mexico. If you really look at Roman Catholicism today, most Catholics, and this is true of a lot of Protestant Christianities as well, aren't centered in Europe anymore. They're in Latin America, they're in Asia, they're in Africa. Most Catholics live in the two-thirds world, not in the United States and in Europe. And Paul VI, being very prescient about this, he took a multicultural approach to the Roman Curia and to the College of Cardinals and said, you can't have a bunch of white European men speaking on behalf of all of the Roman Catholic Church when the majority of Catholics are no longer white Europeans. He also instituted traveling programs in the Catholic Church, making sure that people had multicultural experiences, like going to India, going to the Holy Land. In fact, he himself would travel to these places. And this sounds so astonishing, but he was the first pope since Peter to go back to the Holy Land. It's a very, 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 very weird thing when you think about it, that all of those years, for centuries, popes did not go back to Jerusalem. But Paul VI said, we need to do this. It's important. And yet, Paul VI was, like other popes, a pope of buts. Even though he would do these very progressive things, there was also this but this, but that, in which he would kind of backtrack a bit on a lot of the things that people thought were more progressive and liberal. One of the things he does is he really opens up Catholic biblical scholarship. Yet, he also takes some very conservative stances when it comes to things like morality, women's ordination, etc. And yet, he's really responsible in some cases, along with John the 23rd and Vatican II, for telling Catholic biblical scholars, you know what, it's okay for you to now engage in those Enlightenment methods of biblical criticism. to talk about historical criticism, the historical Jesus, to talk about archaeology. And in a sense, Paul VI was saying, hey, we don't need to be worried about what we're going to find. The church will survive. Christianity will survive, no matter what scholars find. And yet while he was doing this, that seemed open and liberal, he was also doing things that seemed more in line with kind of things you would expect coming back out of the papal monarchy. Certainly a pope who had the most influence on modern Catholicism is John Paul II, and that's simply because he lived for so long, 1978 to 2005. John Paul II is a complex, controversial, and even polarizing figure in modern Catholicism. He's loved, he's hated, he's misunderstood. You can go to a bookstore and read biographies about John Paul II that will tell you he was the greatest thing that ever happened to the church. You can go and read biographies that will say he's the worst thing that ever happened to the church. And it's hard to know what to make of John Paul II because, again, not enough time has passed. I mean, at the moment of giving this lecture, John Paul II's only been dead for 13 years. And so what he did to the church and the reforms he made and the things he said, they're still with the church and still being analyzed by theologians, historians, and scholars. John Paul II was, for lack of a better term, a rock star pope because he was really the first pope that realized the importance of television and media. He realized that the world is a media-saturated world. So he knew, I've got to be on television. I've got to have the right persona for the camera. And you know, if you go and listen to his speeches on television, especially when he was young, if you see when he first became pope, I mean, the media just loved him. Whether you agreed with him or disagreed with him, he was willing to take questions from reporters. He would engage with people. He would engage with the audience. This is very similar to what you see with Pope Francis, where Francis is shaking hands and hugging people and kissing babies and all that sort of stuff. John Paul II, in fact, realizes that if the Catholic faith is going to survive, the Vatican better get on the internet. It better understand things like social media. In fact, because of John Paul II, Pope Francis has a Twitter account. But there were a lot of questions about John Paul II. Was he a conservative pope, or was he a liberal pope, or was he a moderate pope? And it's really hard to know what to make of this. I tend to fall on the side of historians that say he was a conservative pope and did some damage to the church, but at the same time he was a very complex individual. What I mean by this is he did not like this phenomenon called liberation theology that was occurring among Latin American Catholics. He was afraid that a lot of Roman Catholics in Latin America were too interested in Marxism. And he was afraid that what was going to happen is that a lot of priests, bishops, etc., who believed in liberation theology in Latin America, he was afraid they were going to give up Catholicism for communism. And a lot of people have said this is because John Paul II lived through the Cold War, and being Polish, he understood problems with fascism, he didn't like the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. And yet at the same time, what's so strange about John Paul II is while he was denouncing certain principles of liberation theology, he was borrowing a lot of its language. He would talk about, for instance, in his writings, the preferential option for the poor, the idea that God is on the side of the poor and not on the side of the rich, or that God is on the side of the oppressed and not on the side of the oppressor. A lot of people, when they look back to the papacy of John Paul II, think that John Paul II was this great lover of the United States, that he and Ronald Reagan were best buds. In some respects they were, because they both were on the same page when it came to the issue of abortion. But what a lot of people don't realize is that John Paul II was one of the most outspoken popes when it came to nuclear weapons. The story is often told that behind closed doors, John Paul II would really get on the case of Reagan, saying, you need to stop nuclear armament. You need to stop creating this thing. Engage in disarmament. And he wanted Reagan and he wanted the Soviet Union to sit down and end the building of nuclear weapons. What a lot of people saw is they didn't see that. Again, what they saw is a pope who spoke out against abortion, a pope who spoke out against women being ordained in the church. And yet, that's as much as that is true, he is also a pope that spoke out against U.S. foreign policy. He spoke out against unregulated capitalism. He spoke out against nuclear proliferation. And many historians have said that as much credit as the United States, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush Sr. get for the fall of the Berlin Wall, a lot of people don't realize that a bigger player in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe was the Catholic Church and John Paul II working behind the scenes. So again, John Paul II is this very complex individual, and it's really hard to know what to make of him because he's only been dead for 13 years. But these debates are going to go on and on. Was he a conservative? Was he liberal? Did he damage Latin America? Did he help it? Was he right? Was he wrong on all of these things? It's really hard to say. But if you're a very traditionalist Catholic today and you think Catholicism really boils down to things like women not being ordained, being anti-abortion, being anti-gay marriage, then you really look at John Paul II as the Pope, as opposed to looking at someone like John the 23rd. And unfortunately, with all of these individuals, when people do that, they really aren't looking at the complexity or honoring the complexity of these individuals. But as you all know, that's how human beings work. John Paul II was also famous for building bridges. He was a very ecumenical pope. Ecumenism throughout the Catholic Church had started to advance, and then it would set back, and then it would advance. But John Paul II realized, we need to continue the tradition of Vatican II. During Vatican II, a document was written called Nostra Aetate in 1965. One of the most important things about that document from Vatican II is how it speaks of Jews and Muslims. And this was very, very progressive at the time and even today. Nostra Aetate during Vatican II said, Jews, Muslims, and Christians are brothers and sisters. Why? Because we all believe in one God. In fact, Nostra Aetate goes on to say that Catholics have a lot in common with Muslims beyond believing in one God, because Islam in the Quran talks about Mary and venerates Mary. Now, obviously Jesus isn't the Son of God in Islamic tradition, but Mary is seen as a very important individual and Jesus is seen as a prophet. So Nostra Aetate wants there to be dialogue and sort of a détente, really, between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, saying, look, we have more in common. We are all children of Abraham. We have more in common than not. And Nostra Aetate went on to talk about Hinduism and Buddhism and so on and so forth, and to say that it's better to be a religious individual than not. And you see this trend continuing with Nostra Aetate all the way down through Pope Francis. But with John Paul, he really starts implementing in very practical ways the ideas of Nostra Aetate and the changes in Nostra Aetate. He starts apologizing as Pope for a lot of the terrible things the Catholic Church did in the name of God. Not doing enough for the Jews, the Crusades, the pogroms. He apologizes to Muslims. He starts visiting the concentration camps. He wants to dialogue with leaders of other faiths. Now, he got criticized for this because some people wondered, should the Pope apologize? If you sit on the throne of Peter and you speak for Peter and you speak for Christ, should you apologize? I mean, many Catholics applauded this. Many Catholics couldn't believe he was doing this because it looked like the equivalent of the President of the United States apologizing for things the United States has done. And so people wondered, does this show John Paul II as being strong, which I think it does, or did it show him being weak? But John Paul II really wanted to reach out, and he wanted to build bridges between Catholicism, all the different Protestant churches, and the Orthodox churches in the East. I mean, he really did, despite things he did that weren't so great, is he really, really did try to build these bridges. Now, the thing that's always going to remain the black mark, the stain on the papacy of John Paul II is what did he know and what did he not know about priests, bishops, etc. in the church who were molesting children? And how much of it did he cover up? That is always going to be the issue with John Paul II. Is there plausible deniability? Who knows? Unfortunately, we don't have all the information we would like to have for that, but more and more stuff that comes out seems to suggest he knew more, and that he engaged in this practice of protecting priests and bishops by simply relocating them to Rome and to the Vatican, where it was much harder for local authorities, government authorities, to try these individuals. When John Paul II died, his right-hand man, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, became Pope. Today, Pope Benedict XVI is emeritus Pope because he retired. Benedict XVI is probably a guy that never, ever, ever, ever should have been Pope, and people wonder if he really even wanted to be Pope. Basically, he was seen as a bridge between John Paul II and somebody else, like a Pope Francis. If you know anything about the life of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, it's a very interesting story. He was an academic, a theologian, very, very smart guy. Seems like he was happiest teaching in universities in Germany. He actually, at the start of his career, was a very liberal theologian that had a flip-flop experience and became very, very conservative. And yet at the same time, he said a lot of things that people just ignored. Well before Pope Francis was talking about the importance of Catholics taking care of the environment, Benedict was writing about it in his Catholic social encyclicals, in his Catholic social letters. Benedict, in fact, when you read some of the stuff that Benedict had to say, it's as if Francis is saying it out loud while Benedict was being the academic and putting it all into writing. Benedict, unlike John Paul II, did not like the spotlight. He obviously still doesn't. You rarely ever hear from him or see him. He didn't come across well on TV. He just sort of came across as this crotchety old man. Is he conservative? I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, it's the same thing with John Paul II. The tendency is to say, yes, he was very, very conservative. He was the head, as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, he was the head of the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If you remember, the CDF is the modern version of the Spanish Inquisition. The question with Benedict, much like with John Paul II, is always going to be, how much did he know about the priest scandals? How much did he know and cover up? How much did he keep from John Paul II? What is he protecting? What is he not saying? What does he also know about the scandals with the Vatican Bank? Basically, Benedict XVI was somebody that was meant to keep the church going after the death of John Paul II. And many historians think that Benedict XVI retired because all of these things were starting to get to him. The scandals, whether it was the priest scandals, whether it was cover-ups, whether it was the Vatican Bank, so he just stepped down. He is Pope Emeritus. This is not like the Babylonian captivity of the papacy or anything like that. You don't have two popes today. You have a Pope Emeritus and then the Pope. This is a picture, of course, of Benedict XVI. Today, the current Pope is Pope Francis, and it is very hard to know what to make of Pope Francis because he's still Pope, and he really has not been Pope all that long. Many people thought they were getting a much more conservative Pope than they got. Francis himself is a contradiction because one day he will speak out saying something like he has no right to judge gay people, saying things like, "Who am I to judge?" He will embrace gay men and women. He will seem to be signaling that the Catholic Church should be more open on this. And then the very next day, there will be a press conference where he will say, gay men should not be becoming priests. There will never be same-sex marriages in the Catholic Church like there are in the Episcopal Church. And the same thing with women's ordination. Some days he seems to be opening the doors to this. Other days he seems to be saying no whatsoever. He will go down, certainly in history, as being the most outspoken pope on the challenges of climate change. He has presented a real challenge for Republican Catholics in the United States who belong to the Republican Party, because people like Paul Ryan, John Boehner, many, many others don't quite know what to do as Roman Catholics who are Republican when their party thinks differently about climate change than their church does. In fact, Pope Francis has said that climate change is a pro-life issue. He's tried to make being pro-life much larger than just simply being against abortion. Of course, the most fascinating thing about Pope Francis is he's not a European pope. He's not German like Benedict. He's not Polish like John Paul II. He is from Argentina. This really shows you the change in the Catholic Church, and it's really affirmation that most Catholics today come from the global South, not from Europe and not from North America. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the papacy of Pope Francis. It's puzzling, to say the least. A lot of people have jumped on the Francis bandwagon. I'm always a little bit more cautious on these things. As a friend of mine says, it won't be Francis who really does anything one way or the other for the Catholic Church. It'll be the Pope after Francis. And that will tell us a lot about the Catholic Church. If the Pope after Francis that's elected is much more to the left of center than the right of center, that'll say something. If the Pope after Francis is more to the right of center, that will also tell us something about the Church. So again, with modern history, we just don't know where this is going. But Francis, much like John Paul II, unlike Benedict XVI, loves media, knows how to work a crowd, all that sort of stuff. Most Catholic historians would tell you, whatever you say about the popes in the 20th century and the 21st century, the modern Catholic Church is about the age, it should really be called the age of the laity, because anything that ever gets done in the Catholic Church in the 20th century, the 21st century, that's good for the Church, that's different, that's thinking outside of the box, it doesn't come from the top, it comes from the bottom and moves up. Part of this is simply pragmatism, because we have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer people, men, becoming priests. This is why Catholic churches are closing. This is why there's all this debate about should we let married men become priests. I think you will see that happening well before you will ever see women, unfortunately, being ordained as priests. I think women should be ordained as priests, in case you're wondering. But we're seeing fewer and fewer men going into the priesthood. And what we're seeing instead is more and more and more lay ministers, the laity having to do more for the Church. And what this tells us is the modern Catholic Church is still a church going through growing pains. And maybe the Church has always been going through growing pains. But this isn't a church that has all the power it once had, yet it is still a gigantic institution on the face of this planet. It has influence. It has the ear of ambassadors, of presidents, of prime ministers. I mean, it really can impact the world, and yet at the same time, it is searching for a new and more modern identity that started back with Vatican II. If this is also the age of the laity, there have been questions about should we have increased clericalism. One response to this being the age of the laity is for certain Catholics to try and get as many young men to become priests as possible, and to bring back this idea that the priest, father, knows best. And all of this right now is still being rocked by the challenges of the sexual abuse cases, like in the the Archdiocese of Boston. In fact, if you want to see how mammoth all of this is, I really recommend that film Spotlight, which talks about the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe uncovering all the horrible, terrible things that were covered up in the Archdiocese of Boston. And you really see the politics and all of this of the Catholic Church, of the city of Boston itself, et cetera, et cetera. But as many historians have said, the Roman Catholic Church is never going to finish these growing pains until it comes to grips with the sex abuse scandals that are still being uncovered day by day. And again, sometimes Francis has done a much better job at this, sometimes not so much. So let me give you some final concluding thoughts on Roman Catholic Church history. Remember, everything in Roman Catholic Church history is both and. It should not be either or, even though there are so many periods of Catholic Church history where it has been either or. True Catholicism has always been both and. Never throw the baby out with the bathwater. Which means that Roman Catholicism is also about tradition and innovation. You go back to the past to bring that into the future and update it. You innovate with it. Like I said, you never throw it out. If anything, you always Catholicize things and re-Catholicize things. Roman Catholicism in the modern world is also about, as it's always been, evangelization. And it's about faith and reason working together. Unfortunately, many forms of Christianity today, whether they're Protestant, whether they're Catholic, whether they're Orthodox, give up one or the other. They emphasize more the spirit and spirituality, or they emphasize more logic and reason. True Catholicism, if we learn anything from church history, is supposed to be faith and reason working together. Religion and science not fighting one another, but working together to better society. Yes, when the world changes, the church can change. It is one of the strangest things to hear some Catholics say the church never changes. Hopefully one of the things you have gotten out of this course is, yes, the Roman Catholic Church has changed a lot over its existence. In fact, there are examples of popes like John Paul II apologizing for mistakes that were made in the past. And in many respects, all of this is very, very encouraging. There have been, throughout Roman Catholic Church history, as there is throughout any religious history, institutional missteps. They should be talked about, they should be dealt with. There should be justice for those missteps. But throughout Roman Catholic Church history, there have always been grassroots movements. The Dominicans, the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Ursulines, the Jesuits, etc. Lay movements, the Catholic worker movement, that have stepped up, pardon the baseball metaphor, to the plate and said, we're going to do this ourselves if our bishops, if our pope won't do it.